Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Penn Vicarage. As always, on this Tuesday morning, lovely to see you. Thank you, as always, for joining us, and I hope you're well and cheerful today as we continue our adventure through the Psalms. And today we're in Psalm 77, so without further ado, Psalm 77, here it comes. I cry aloud to God that he may hear me. In the day of my trouble I seek the Lord. In the night my hand is stretched out without wearying. My soul refuses to be comforted. I think of God and I moan. I meditate and my spirit faints. You keep my eyelids from closing. I'm so troubled that I cannot speak. I consider the days of old and remember the years of long ago. I commune with my heart in the night. I meditate and search my spirit. Will the Lord spurn forever and never again be favourable? Has his steadfast love ceased forever? Are his promises at an end for all time? Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion? And I say, it's my grief that the right hand of the Lord, the Most High, has changed. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I'll meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? Sorry. You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid, and the very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies thundered. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way through the sea was through the sea, your path through the mighty waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. And this is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so Psalm 77. What do we know? What's context? We do not know. We don't know. All we do know is this guy here is Asaph. Asaph wrote it. And this guy is clearly in some recounting about some very, very serious crisis of faith. It also says it's of Jeduthun as well. It says it's how does it describe it? It says the psalm is to the leader according to Jeduthun of Asaph a psalm. Now Jeduthun is thought to have founded 3 choirs. He's also with Ethan. He's also thought to be the same guy as Ethan. Beg your pardon. Yes, Ethan the Jezreelite. Okay, mentioned twice in First Chronicles. He's thought to have founded 3 choirs, and is thought to be known for great wisdom. That's who Jeduthun was. So he's a founder of 3 choirs, and a person of great wisdom. Okay. So what do we have in the psalm? We have essentially it's in 3 bits. There's a miserable bit between 1 and 3. There's another miserable bit between 4 and 10. And there's a more cheerful bit, considerably more cheerful bit between 11 and 20. So that again, there's a miserable bit between 1 to 3. There's another miserable bit between 4 and 10. And there's a considerably more hopeful bit between 11 and 20. That's the kind of general, no commentator will put it like that, but that's essentially what you've got here in the psalm. And so what you've got here are essentially, it's in 3 bits, as I say. In verses 1 to 3, you have this guy in a serious, he's really inside himself, really. He is really struggling, and he's clearly in such a bad place, so to speak, that in a sense he can't see beyond the end of what's going on for him at the moment. And the words, beg your pardon, are very personal. So he talks about my trouble, I seek, my hand, my soul, I think, I moan, I meditate, and my spirit. So what you've got in verses 1 to 3 is that Asaph is clearly having a very serious crisis of faith. But in verses 1 to 3, it's very much talking about what's going on inside himself, okay? So whatever the context may be, whatever's going on for him, he talks about how he feels within himself when he seeks God. So he's got some problem, he's seeking after God, but like I say, he's really in what you might call an internal turmoil here. He really is, he's really struggling here. And as I said, he refuses to be comforted, and he thinks of God and it's very much what's going on inside himself. That's verses 1 to 3. And I think, just want to say straight away that isn't it great that people are honest. I mean, bear in mind that the Psalms are the Old Testament hymn book, and these are things that used to be sung. They'd be sung by choirs to musical instruments. Isn't it great, as I say, that the Psalms are so honest? So many of our hymns that we have are almost almost too cheerful. There are very few hymns that acknowledge the fact that there's difficulties in life sometimes. I mean, one of my favourites is "Just as I Am Without One Plea," which actually talks about how, tossed about with many a conflict, many a doubt, and it's right that we acknowledge that sometimes. I think sometimes in church we're having a hard time ourselves, and it looks like everybody else is fine. It looks like all the hymns are everything. We should be happy all the time, and so on and so on and so on. Isn't it great? Here we have in the Psalms Asaph here being brutally honest about how he feels. So in verses 1 to 3, you have him, in a sense, in a real internal turmoil, and this how and almost he can't quite see beyond himself. So he's really inside himself. He's really internal turmoil there. Verses 4 to 10 are rather different. It's again he's still in this crisis of faith, but this time he looks to God, and looks to God for help, and he is clearly really struggling here. He's having a major crisis of faith here. And he turns it round on God, and he asks God some pretty brutal questions, because he's saying, look, I'm in trouble here. And he says questions like, will God spurn me forever? He feels spurned by God. And he's actually asking this very deep question, will God spurn me forever? He goes on, has God stopped being faithful? The whole of the covenant of God was about God's faithfulness. That even though we were unfaithful, God was faithful to us, and so on. And here he asks the question: has God stopped being faithful? And he goes on. This is brutal stuff. Have God's promises become null and void? That's how he feels. God makes promises, and here he's asking the question that in the Bible, in the Psalms, in the hymn book, you might say, he's asking the question: have God's promises become null and void? And he goes on, has God forgotten to be gracious? We always talk about God being gracious to us, God being full of grace and compassion, mercy, and so on. Grace means undeserved love. And he's asking the question, has God forgotten to do this? And he goes on, has God's anger terminated any compassion? We have a God of compassion and mercy. And here he's asking the question quite seriously, has God stopped being compassionate? So these are really, really big questions. And essentially he's asking, has God changed? God was good, God was promised. And he's asking the question, has God stopped doing these things? And these are the questions he asks in verses 4 to 10. So, and you can see why he ends up by saying, and I say, it is my grief that the right hand of the Most High has changed. So you can kind of see, so in the first 3 verses is his internal turmoil inside himself. Then he goes on to question whether God has, whether God spurned him, whether God stopped being faithful, whether God's promises are null and void, whether God's forgotten to be gracious, and whether God's terminated compassion. So you can kind of see where he's coming from on that. And these are very, very, this is a very serious crisis of faith. Now at this point, if somebody was coming to me with a crisis of faith as their vicar, I'd be suggesting to you, what we need to do is remember times in the past in our lives when God's been good to us. So in my case, it might be reminding myself of times when, God guided me through something, or God helped me through a difficult situation, or the time when God called me to pen, things like that. I can look back on times like that when God has very clearly to me acted very, very clearly and decisively. So I know that, God's with me and God's there. And I'd be asking people to look back in your life and try and I'd be encouraging you to remember, take a note of remember times when God's been good and God's been clear and God's been actually decisive in your life, to remember for occasions like this. But you get the impression Asaph has kind of tried that in the Watches of the Night, and that hasn't worked. In the end, what he does do is he goes back to the great stories of the Bible. He goes back to times in the past where God rescued them, and essentially he's talking about the time when he rescued the people under Moses, from Egypt, and he rescued them across the Red Sea and across the Jordan River and so on. So he's looking back to the great stories of the Bible. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's really important for us to carry on doing things like just remembering the Bible as we're doing talks like this. It's good to read the Bible regularly. That's why it's good to go to church, to reenact every week things like the story of Holy Communion, remind ourselves what Jesus has done for us. And coming up soon, we've got Easter, remind us when God raised Jesus from the dead. And here we have the psalmist Asaph looking back on times in the past when God has helped his people. You know, when the waters stopped, when God commanded the waters and God demonstrated his power over the weather and so on and so on and so on. So in a sense here, it's not enough for him to look back on times of his own personal life. It's important for him to remind himself of times when God's acted decisively to his people, the great stories of the Bible, which is why it's important to learn them ourselves, to teach them to our children. Keep teaching the stories of the Bible to your children, and also to keep going to church and being reminded of the Holy Communion, Easter and Christmas, and times when God has acted decisively in the past. So here we have this devastating psalm. It's this incredibly profound psalm, which has kind of the crisis of faith, and then halfway through at verse 11, there's a complete change, which is hopeful. So you've got him. First, you look at the crisis inside himself in verses 1 to 3, how he feels he's really struggling. Then he turns to God and he asks God these really deep questions. Have you forgot? Have you changed? And then in verses 11 to the end, he reminds himself of the great stories of the Bible, and so should we. And my friends, I'm sure we've all been through times when we felt like Asaph has here. And it's right, isn't it great that he was honest about that? Isn't it great that we can be honest before God? But also to remind ourselves of great things that God's done for us. But in particular, let's constantly remind ourselves of the times that God's helped his people in the Bible. So keep coming to church, keep reading the Bible, keep teaching the stories to your children, so we can be reminded for times like this when we encounter them too. God bless you. Have a lovely